Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's launch of the final report from the APPG on housing and social mobility, improving opportunities, how to support social housing tenants into sustainable employment. My name is Rachel Orr. I'm the Director of Place Shapers, and it's been our pleasure to be the co-secretariat of this APPG alongside Communities that Work. We first launched this APPG in 2018, believe it or not. And I think at that point we were pretty convinced that our launch event would take place probably of an evening in a slightly stuffy room in Parliament with some warm white wine. And that's not quite how it's transpired. But we've got a smashing lineup of speakers. We've got a bunch of questions to put to you. We've got some time for you to ask us questions and a really interesting report to discuss and unpick this morning. So thank you very much for coming, and we're really looking forward to the event and the discussion that we're going to have today. As I said, we're going to ask you a number of questions throughout the event. We're going to start straight away. So a poll question is about to jump up on your screens. And just an easy one to kick off with. Do you think that housing providers can play an important role in delivering the government's levelling up agenda? Simple yes or no. 98% said yes, and 2% said no. Whoever the 2% was, you can see me at the end. You're wrong. Thank you, everyone. And as I say, there'll be a few more of those to come, so keep an eye on your screen for those. So, an overview of the agenda for this morning's event. First of all, we're going to hear from Peter Aldous MP, who's the co-chair of the APPG, alongside Liz Twist MP, excuse me. Then we're going to have a short video that's going to whiz us through the key recommendations and findings from the report. We've then got three great speakers. We've got Kate Schoen, who's the Managing Director of the Taurus Foundation and the Chair of Communities that Work. Jonathan Higgs, who's the Chief Executive of Raven Housing Trust and a board member at Place Shapers. And Laura Kernick, who's the Chair of Peabody Housing Association and housing grandee, as I'm sure you'll agree. We're then going to have a discussion. We hope there's lots of questions that you have that you can put to our panel, which will be our speakers, and they will be joined by Lindsay Sweeney, who's the Managing Director of Communities that Work, and Ken Gibb, who's the author of the report from the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, or CASH to you and I. Please do tweet along with the event, hashtag improving opportunities. So we can capture the debate, and also so everyone who's missed out on being here today can still keep abreast of the discussion and the findings from the report. So before I hand over to Peter, we're going to have our second poll question. Slightly more stretching this one, it's a multiple choice. So which of these barriers do you think people in your community face most often when they are trying to access employment? A, accessible public transport. B, affordable childcare. C, support during the transitional period into work. D, lack of digital access and skills. Or E, others. Interesting. So there's a bit of a split on the results. So the highest number of votes were for the lack of digital access and skills, and no doubt that's been far more keenly felt in the last 6 months than it had previously, although still a huge issue. 25%, so just behind that, a support during the transitional period as people are starting work. Closely behind, access to affordable childcare. and then 13% have said accessible public transport. So clearly all of these are things that people see as an issue, and it's interesting to see that there's a kind of quite an even spread of votes across those. Thank you, that's great. So I'm now going to hand over to the chair, the co-chair of the APPG, Peter Aldous MP. Peter.
Rachel, very many thanks for that introduction, and I can't promise the excitement of the polls, but special thanks to yourself, to Communities at Work and Place Shapers for their work in producing this report, which comes at an extremely important time as the harsh realities of COVID-19 hit home on the employment market as the furloughing scheme comes to an end on the 31st of October. And the report, I think, confirms that housing and employment, which are, I think, probably the two most important features of everyone's everyday lives, are inextricably linked. Now, you could say that is a statement of the bleeding obvious, but I think the report, the benefits of the report, it is evidence-based. An enormous amount of research has gone on to this, and I think it provides conclusions which should guide policy going forward. And not just policy. Policy is something you talk about. It's actually, in many ways, words are cheap, but it is not just in the policy right, it's also then a question of implementation. And so often in Whitehall, in Westminster, you sort of press the policy button, you then put the car supposedly into gear, and then in the rest of the country, nothing happens. So it's therefore very important that that policy is driven through implementation. And I think where we are now, with the challenges we face, it's absolutely crucial that it does work. I'll just quickly go through the 5 conclusions of the report, and I won't try to steal the thunder of those who are going to follow me. But I think the first one is one that I see regularly: continuity of funding. There does appear in government, and it's probably for short-term political purposes, to have lots of announcements on funding every single year. So it creates an impression of doing things. The trouble is, if you just have announcements every single year and funding streams only run for a year, there's not much you can do in that year. You have the period working up for the bid, you then have the euphoria, you've got the bid, you then settle down over the next couple of months to actually implement what you were doing. And then suddenly, after about another 6 months, you realize, Christ, the stream comes to an end in a few months' time, got to bid again. So, and actually doing that, you achieve very, very little. So what you do need to have, you need to, I think, to have longer term funding streams. I would suggest probably the order of 3 to 4 years. I think you also need to have a localized approach, in that we don't just have one jobs market in the UK, we have lots of different jobs markets with lots of different opportunities in those particular areas. The third point is you do need to link investment in social housing to employment, and some housing associations do this remarkably well. And we have found that actually there's a postcode lottery developed, whereby in those areas where you've got those housing associations who are right up to the task, who are really infused and fully engaged, the system works remarkably well. In other areas where there aren't such providers, there is a vacuum. And that's how that postcode lottery has developed. And one means of overcoming that is when it comes to social housing and the funding for social housing, that should be linked to the actual delivery on employment issues. Now, it's not just incentivizing that delivery, you also got to support those organizations through and allow them to build up the expertise to be able to do that. I think my fourth point, again, and it comes back to the short-term nature of politics, is, and those providers who are given particular contracts, you're judged on your results. And so the idea is to get people into work as quickly as possible. Then you've ticked that box, which you can show to show to government, but then say what happens afterwards to that person isn't really your issue. Well, it should be your issue. And it's not just a question of getting someone into a job, it's then an issue of working with them to ensure that they remain in that job, develop skills, and then can probably move on to another job. The final point I would just highlight is, and we've already seen that in the polls, is a question of barriers. We can talk about these, you might say, some respects, highfalutin initiatives and policies, but if we don't overcome those everyday barriers, then we're not going to deliver. And obviously, the ones that one thinks about, the ones one thinks about normally are things like child support and family support. Also, you can have a problem with the benefit system that you need temporary financial support to get over that hump of getting into employment, and there's extra costs that involves. As we've heard, the transport issue, so often in rural areas, that is a problem. It's a problem at the moment as our whole bus network has ground down with the pandemic. It's now very gradually being rolled out again as the providers sort of get their services back up and running fully. And of course, we've also heard the digital divide that we've got in the UK. I had this last night. I was talking to a care farm provider who's got some very good ideas, and suddenly we had that all too familiar problem, full flow, suddenly we both froze. So those are those everyday barriers that we do need to overcome. I think in conclusion, I would just highlight two things. First of all, we really are talking about breaking out of silos and that collaborative working. If we look in Westminster, we're not just talking about the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government, we're talking about BEIS, we're talking about the DWP. There needs to be that cross-departmental working. There also needs to be, and I think it's a good point, I've talked about the localized system. That means working with local government more. Are we going to have a problem that those areas that have devolved government are where these arrangements are going to work best? And that's a problem. And so we could be accentuating that postcode lottery. And that's a problem that national government does need to confront urgently. And I think final point I would make is we need to challenge those working practices that we've built up over a long time, that desire, and it's all, I'm afraid, in part of the political process, that desire for quick wins that don't actually deliver very much and don't deliver that long-term gain that we're looking for to individuals, their families, society, and also their economy as well. So many thanks to all of you for putting on this event this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing the panelists and then in due course taking these messages back to government. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for such a useful overview of the report and the findings, but moreover, thank you so much for your continued leadership and support and kind of championing of this agenda throughout this APPG. And, you know, before we even started, and I'm sure that'll go far into the future, it's really clear how committed you are to this, and we really, really appreciate that. So as Peter has mentioned, there are a number of kind of interventions and programmes that are run that can try and help support social housing residents into employment. So before we show you the video that is just going to summarise those findings that Peter's just talked through, we've got another polling question. and that is, which of these, the following options do you think is most effective in helping working age social housing residents into employment? Is it government funded programmes, such as the DWP programmes, locally delivered programmes, investment and contracts that focus on social value, tailored one-to-one support, or something else? So a clear winner, tailored one-to-one support, which, not to give you too much of a spoiler, you will find was one of the really key things that we found in our APPG report. And really interestingly, the option with the second highest number of votes is locally delivered programs. So really building on those insights from the report and from Peter about the real importance and expertise in that local focus. Fantastic, thank you everyone. So now we're going to go seamlessly to a short film which is going to summarise our report and its key findings and recommendations.
Employment rates, earnings, and advancement in work are generally lower for working-age people in social housing than for working-age people who privately rent or own their own home. Most of this can be readily explained, but stubborn barriers remain. Through this new piece of research, the APPG for Housing and Social Mobility has examined, firstly, the barriers people of working age in social housing face when seeking meaningful and rewarding employment. Secondly, the success factors from social landlords' initiatives to help people secure work and grow in their jobs. And thirdly, which policies could secure better outcomes for people in social housing and their communities. This video summarises the key findings of the APPG Inquiries report and spotlights the areas where policymakers should focus their attention to help drive forward employment and training for thousands of people across the UK. Stigma and discrimination are still apparent in some discussions about social housing, and critics of the sector often suggest there is something about social housing that worsens the employment prospects of its residents. The evidence says this is not so. Social housing at affordable rents can give people the security they need to create a foundation for success, helping them overcome barriers and, in turn, secure employment. But we need to do more to tackle barriers such as job availability and jobs quality, transport, and childcare support networks that all affect people's employment success. This new report examines how these barriers can be lowered and help increase social mobility for working-age social housing tenants. European social funding, or ESF, is on a cliff edge and will soon run out. Housing providers rely on this funding in order to deliver many of their employment and training services and support people into work. Can the proposed Shared Prosperity Fund fill the gap? If these funds aren't replaced, we'll risk widening the social mobility gap and be rowing back on the levelling up agenda promised in 2019. A national, one-size-fits-all approach fails to deliver impact in the regions, preventing smaller housing providers and partners from teaming up to deliver support in areas that need it. Instead, programs and investment should focus on aligning to local job markets. Local government, local housing providers and partners can better deliver employment support to meet the needs of local communities. A localised approach will lead to better outcomes and a more efficient use of funding. The housing sector has a long record of directing investment back into its community by offering employment, skills, and apprenticeship support. We can harness this power to guarantee that jobs and apprenticeship opportunities are created for local people by requiring our suppliers and contractors to commit to providing these opportunities. There's clear evidence from this inquiry that providing support across the entire employment journey works. This means focusing on employability, creating mentoring opportunities, and providing customized one-to-one support for those far from work, as well as training, education and skills, and job search support. Alongside all of this, we must remove long-standing, wider barriers to employment. These include poor or expensive public transport, which limits the search area for employment, accessible, affordable childcare needs to be prioritised by both housing associations and by government, temporary, time-limited financial support for those entering the job market to help cover extra essential costs related to starting a job, and finally, eradicating digital exclusion with access to quality, affordable broadband for all. Without removing these barriers to work, we risk failing to create the right conditions that support working-age people from taking steps towards employment or succeeding in work.
Fantastic. Well, we're shortly going to hear from our three keynote speakers who are going to delve a little deeper into some of those recommendations and give their views on them. Just before we do, it's time for another poll. And we're just going to ask you about the policy recommendations that are contained within the report. We think they're all super important, but as you will know, any good piece of kind of influencing work needs to do some prioritization. So which of these policy recommendations do you think that place shapers and communities that work and others should prioritize to take forward? Is it ensuring the funding continuity for employment support programs? Devolving funding so we can deliver better locally, linking investments and contracts to social value, or providing tailored one-to-one support as a key component in employment support programs? Or are there others that we've missed out and that we can hopefully hear from you about in the Q&A? Again, it's nearly a three-way tie on that question. The one with the most votes is about devolving funding so we can deliver locally, followed very closely by ensuring the continuity of funding. And then again, the importance of providing that tailored one-to-one support within the programs that we're delivering. Fantastic, thank you everyone. Right, I am now going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Kate Schoen. She's the Managing Director of the Taurus Foundation and the Chair of Communities That Work. Kate.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to everyone who's joined today. As Rachel said, I'm Managing Director of Taurus Foundation and I'm also Chair of Communities That Work. And we're delighted to have supported and contributed to this very important piece of work. So for those of you that don't know, Taurus Foundation is the charitable arm of the Taurus Group. We own and manage 40,000 homes in the northwest of England, and we support the work of the foundation through the surpluses that are generated through our repairs, maintenance and construction company and our development company. So we've got a unique model of gift aid that allows us to invest in social impact activities such as employment support. So the foundation does play a lead role in helping our customers into work. And last year we helped 651 people into employment. So prior to the pandemic in the Northwest, we actually had really good employment levels. But the pandemic has had a significant impact for us, and that's resulted in the claimant counts in the three key areas that we operate in, St Helens, Warrington and Liverpool, doubling since January. and young people have been disproportionately affected by that. So we've really seen the impact of this, like many other of our colleagues across the country. But we've continued to help people into work throughout the pandemic. DWP and National Lottery programmes, such as our New Leaf programme, which delivers employment support across Cheshire and Warrington, have been critical in continuing to help people into employment, particularly those who are furthest from the labour market. So we've been helping them on their journey into work. And locally designed programmes such as this can play a significant part in the levelling up agenda. We need to close those regional disparity gaps. So what we've actually got is a long track record of our sector delivering and creating employment programmes. So New Leaf, for example, that has 19 partner organisations that deliver on that programmes, and we see similar programmes with the likes of Love London Working and the partnership that has there. And I'm pleased to say that this inquiry calls for continued approach to local delivery and devolved funding. So as Peter said, you know, we've been waiting for a long time for the launch of the Shared Prosperity Fund to replace the European Social Fund. And as unemployment continues to rise, the need for this is critically important. The need for good quality employment support, which can be delivered in partnership at a local level, is paramount. And for me in particular, the need is amplified, particularly as the Liverpool City region has gone into a Tier 3 lockdown, and we're already starting to see unemployment catapult. We've got to help more people into work. So I know that as a sector, we'll continue to do all that we can to help people into work. And to cite one piece of work that we're currently involved with, the Kickstarting Housing Network, where we've identified 1,200 jobs for young people in under 4 weeks, which will see an investment of £8.5 million into those young people. So the findings in this inquiry I see as potentially straightforward. We can utilise the findings to solve problems which social housing providers are able to help with. So collectively, we're able to think strategically, we're able to join up skills, training, employment support, employability and customised work, and we're also here for the long term. So I'm keen to see how we can develop these conversations going forward, working with our colleagues across different sectors to, as Peter said, turn that policy into much needed action. And I think now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Higgs.
Thanks very much, Kate. Shall I just dive on, Rachel?
Go straight ahead, Jonathan, yes.
That's great, thanks. Well, welcome everyone, good morning. My name's Jonathan Higgs, I'm Chief Executive at Raven Housing Trust and also Director on the board of Place Shapers. Place Shapers is a national network of over 100 locally based associations, and we house over 2 million people and pride ourselves on providing much more than a landlord service. And we work with our local partners to make sure all of our communities thrive. And Raven has been proud to be a member of Place Shapers now for the last 10 years. We're a 6,000 home housing association in Surrey, not always thought to be in need of the levelling up agenda, but obviously real areas of deprivation in our part of the world as well. And we have long been an advocate of employment and training projects as part of our offer to our local communities. I've been asked just to provide a few kind of granular examples of what the sector has been doing and draw some lines between the work that's been happening and some of the recommendations of this report, because for many of you listening, you will recognise the soundness of many of these recommendations already, I'm sure. There are many associations that do this work, and I've sought to pick a few examples from Place Shaper members, and you'll forgive me, I'm sure, if I dwell on some of the Raven examples, but they're the ones that I know best. South Yorkshire Housing Association, for example, has been running a good work programme supporting people, including those living with mental health conditions, to find work and continue that support even after employment has started. and continue to manage their good health in the workplace, while North Star Housing Association runs a young women's mentoring scheme in Middlesbrough, linking business women to 14 to 18-year-old women that are still in school and mentoring them to go on to work and further education. There's some good examples there. The first in South Yorkshire, European funded. At Raven, we also run a European funded pathway to employment scheme. This is designed to take a holistic approach, very much the kind of end-to-end approach advocated by the report. Often we're providing support including building confidence, paying for childcare, providing counselling, paying travel expenses, paying for training, brokering volunteer placements and work trials. Very much the kind of granular support, the wraparound support that the report recommends. On average, the participants that come to us have been out of work for over 2.5 years, and only 3% of them you would describe as being ready to go on a job search or work ready. And this is a scheme for people who are a long way from employment, so have a long journey to go, and we provide support from the start of that journey to completion. And we're just about to start a second project, the Working Homes project, which is to run over 3 years. Again, European funded. I was interested to hear what Peter said about the need for 3-year programs. That's the type of program that we've been benefiting from as part of the European funding. And again, this will be wraparound support for anyone living in social housing who is unemployed, living in our area, which is East Surrey and Sussex. You'll have noticed 3 projects I've mentioned, European funded, and I couldn't echo more strongly the call for clarity for long-term funding from the Shared Prosperity Fund, so that we have some clarity of what lies ahead once the European funding comes to an end. Associations can also provide, of course, employment simply because they are a large employer in the area by virtue of the work we do building homes and looking ahead, retrofitting our existing homes. And Raven has run a Step Up to Work programme. Over the last 5 years, we've given 20 people of all ages the opportunity for work placements, and 75% of them going on to employment. I think I would probably close by making the point about the economic impact that associations can have. And this is one of the central calls from the report. And I was really pleased to see the pilot bid for retrofit for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund to run next year, seeking to link funding to local employment and the local employment market. So more of that will find ready participants amongst housing associations and local authorities. So I'd just like to end by again thanking everyone who participated to the report. If we can take this, as Peter suggests, and carry it forward into policy and most importantly implementation, you'll find a lot of local partners, housing associations and the people they work with locally in their communities ready to respond, I'm sure. So I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Jonathan. And if you have a question for Kate or Jonathan or any other member of our panel, please start posting those now. We've got one final great speaker to hear from before we move into the Q&A, but please do start populating your questions so we can get ready to answer those in just a few moments. Lord Kerslake, just before we come to you, we've got one final poll for our audience. So we've heard about the recommendations in the report. So now we'd just like to hear from you. Which of the recommendations do you think the government might have the greatest appetite to take forward? The funding continuity, devolving funding to deliver locally, linking investments and contracts to social value, or ensuring that employment support programmes provide that tailored one-to-one support? Interestingly, people think that the government might have the greatest appetite to devolve funding so it can deliver locally, followed quite closely by linking investments and contracts to social value. Slightly pessimistically, only 21% of people think that there'd be the greatest appetite to ensure funding continuity. So that sounds like there's a job to be done there in terms of making our case more firmly and repeatedly about the real need and importance of that funding continuity. So I'm going to turn now to our final speaker. We're really delighted to have him joining us and to have his support of the inquiry and its findings. So I will hand over now to Lord Kerslake.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm delighted to be able to say a few words at the launch of this report. Now, if this was in Parliament, I would have to declare my interests. But on this occasion, I'd like to talk about 4 connections with this work. First of all, as chair of Peabody, which provides homes to over 150,000 people, mainly in London. Peabody has a strong social mission, and we heard about that from Raven. It goes way beyond the landlord role, and we put a lot into advocacy on behalf of our residents and also community services. And for a long time, employment has been a key part of those community services. Secondly, I'm the chair of the advisory group for Cash, which has undertaken the research. And I think it is a brilliant initiative, brilliantly led by Ken, that's done some groundbreaking work in terms of housing. Thirdly, I'm on the task force set up by Communities at Work, really to look at how on the earth we respond to the challenge of COVID. And I think, again, some brilliant work's been done there. And then finally, I'm a great supporter of the Place Shapers group, which I think is one of the most effective networks in the housing association movement, and have spoken many times at their conferences going back to when I was chief exec of the Homes and Communities Agency. So a lot of connections with this work and a lot of support for what it's trying to achieve. Now, this launch, of course, happens at the time of COVID, and we're still not through this, of course, but we can see already that the need to respond to the health emergency has created an economic emergency. We've seen a dramatic fall, of course, in economic activity. We've seen dramatically rising unemployment. We heard about that earlier from Kate. Likely to exceed 3 million. We're going back to figures that we haven't seen since the 80s. And in fact, we've also seen, of course, record levels of government debt, as it quite rightly, in my view, has intervened to try and stave off the worst effects of the pandemic. But nevertheless, the effect has been profound. And COVID most definitely has not been a leveler. It has hit those most vulnerable hardest, no question about that. I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. What I would say in passing is that the government must resist the temptation to rein in spend in these current circumstances and continue to support those who are most vulnerable, in particular through targeted job schemes. But for me, really important is to keep the enhanced universal credit going beyond April, vitally important. Now, that's the big picture, but what's it like on the ground? Well, Peabody produces a regular index called the Peabody Index that looks at, if you like, the lived experience of its residents. And we recently did one published in September looking at the impact of COVID. And we surveyed 1,000 of our residents. What do we find? Well, we found that 38% of our residents have either lost their job, been furloughed, or are working shorter hours as a result of the lockdown. That's 38%, over a third. Now, of those who've lost their jobs since March, just 13% have found new ones. This is a one-way process at the moment in terms of jobs loss. And 18% of our residents report being in a desperate financial situation, nearly a fifth. And let me just quote one example, which I think is very telling. This person said, I spend as little as I can every day and calculate what I've got, but it's never enough. I'm used to having a bit to put by for bad times, but I've already used up my savings. I couldn't have imagined my situation would get this bad. 1 minute life was normal. Now it's like someone has turned off the switch and there is nothing I can do. That's pretty powerful testimony of just how bad it is for people at the moment. Now, this report, I think, is launched at a very difficult time, but it's actually a message of hope, and it's very, very practical. That's what I love about it. What it says is that social housing can be a boost and definitely is not a barrier to employment. We need to end that stigma. And what it also says, if government and social housing providers do the right thing, they can make a significant impact on the employment outcomes and therefore the quality of people's lives. And in the list of the right things to do, I particularly liked, I think like Peter, the consistency and long-term continuity of government funding. As somebody who worked in central government, I know how much we chopped and changed and how debilitating that was. The Shared Prosperity Fund, I think, offers an opportunity to go even further than 3 or 4 years. I would like to see 5 years or more. Second thing I liked in terms of the right thing to do, embracing local diversity and devolving responsibility. Delighted to see that your questionnaire backed that up very strongly as well. We absolutely have got to move away from the centrist approach in this country, very topical at the moment, and devolve power and funding at a local level. I'm a strong advocate and have been for many years of that. Third point, the size of the DWP commissioning programs is too big, and I remember this happening and feeling at the time we were going in the wrong direction, and it excludes, shuts out good providers who could offer a service. I think another thing I like about it is, and again it's been touched on, the link of social housing investment to employment. I had a go at this when I was at the Homes and Communities Agency. I think we could go a lot further than we did then, make it a very powerful condition of funding that housing associations commit to this. The tailored support to individuals that matches what they actually want and follows through, I think, is crucial. And then finally, I'm a great believer in measuring impact, so we know we're making a difference. The key point for me about all of this is that it is eminently deliverable. There's nothing in this report that couldn't be implemented where there was a will on the part of government and a commitment on the part of housing providers. And as others have said, I think there is a willing audience here. We want to do the best we can for our residents. And this is something that absolutely stands front and centre in terms of their needs. So I really hope this report is a springboard for action. I want it to be widely read in the sector, but also in government departments. But more than read, it's really important that we act on its recommendations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lord Kerslake. And I think we've got you maybe for the next 10 or 15 minutes of the Q&A. Right, yeah. Is that right? Yeah. The floor is now open for questions. I think some people have been posting theirs already, but please do keep doing that. I might just ask the first question directly to you, Lord Kerslake, as a follow-up to your presentation, and perhaps Peter, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that. I think we've all heard the importance of the funding and the continued funding of the Shared Prosperity Fund. So what more do we need to do, place shapers, communities at work, do our members need to be doing to be making the case, and to whom, about the importance of that funding and its continuity?
Yes, I'll kick off, and then Peter, it would be good to hear your thoughts. I think it's about pressing all the buttons, talking to all the relevant departments, DWP, MHCLG and others, and impressing on them the contribution that housing providers can make if we can get the funding right and sort it now. I absolutely understand that government is at the moment overwhelmed with the pressures of responding to the pandemic. I do get that. It must be hell on earth, frankly, at the moment. But the earlier we can get a fix on the fund, and actually the longer we can give commitments, that was one of the strengths of the EU programme, I have to say. It gave long commitments of funding. The earlier we can set up the systems and processes to make the best possible use of the funding, And so I think it's about advocacy, demonstrating through the very practical examples we heard from Jonathan and Kate about what's already being done to make an impact, and persuading government that early decisions would make a huge difference to the effectiveness of the fund.
Fantastic, thank you. Peter, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yes, I think Lord Kerslake said I agree entirely with everything he said. I would just add that there is a comprehensive spending review of some form very quickly on the horizon. Thus, time is of the essence. In government, or in departments, all roads lead ultimately to the Treasury. So I think it's very important to make the point there. I think the Chancellor probably does appreciate the role that housing has to play, and you can look back to another long forgotten era of the 1950s and Harold Macmillan's approach. And I think that, coupled with the urgent emphasis to look at all means of ameliorating the unemployment challenge that we're going to face, I would hope that one would receive a favourable hearing on that.
Great, thank you very much both. And the next question relates to, for me, one of the key findings of the inquiry. It hasn't so much translated into our recommendations, but one of the findings about kind of the role of social housing in terms of whether it supports or inhibits people from finding work. Because I think there's a kind of common stereotype that social housing might be an inhibitor to people finding work. And actually what this report has found, and other reports before it, that actually the affordability and the security of social housing can really help support people into work. Particularly then if we're looking at the employment support programs that more and more social landlords are providing. So it'd be great to hear from the panel kind of what do you think can be done to help kind of challenge that stereotype, that stigma that still exists in terms of social housing being more of a kind of trap in terms of worklessness, as opposed to actually what we're seeing more and more often, it can be a kind of springboard to people being able to find work and progress in work. So maybe if I come to Ken in terms of the findings from the report, and then we'll maybe hear from Lord Kerslake before you need to go, and if any other panelists would like to come in then let me know. But Ken, if we maybe come to you first.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Going back to earlier research that we looked at in background to this and work that we've done at the University of Glasgow before, there is evidence that lower rents and the security that social housing can bring put people in a position where they're better able to get involved in the labour market activities we've been talking about. And how does one communicate that in this kind of wider debate about stigma? I think we need real narratives of examples of those things, and we also need to, I think, draw strongly from the kind of quantitative evidence that people at Lindsay Judge at the Resolution Foundation have shown us, that actually a lot of this outcome gap in employment can be explained by the very factors that put people in housing need in the first place, and that's why they're in social housing, and that's a great thing. And not only that, but there are some unmeasurable things which might actually explain some of the residual differences that exist. So it's quite hard to measure some long-term illnesses or mental health issues, which are there but are not apparent in the data. So I think we need to continually try to really make these messages as clear as we can, and use both the empirical data but also the real stories of real people and how they have benefited from the very presence of social housing in their life to give them a chance to get into work.
Thank you, Ken. Lord Kerslake, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, I very much agree with everything that Ken has said, first of all. and just add a few points really. I think I mentioned earlier the Peabody Index we do, and clearly life is pretty tough for many residents who live in Peabody properties. But I have to tell you, it's nowhere near as tough as it is currently for those in private rented accommodation who are facing very high rents, huge uncertainty, and real anxiety about their tenure. It really is heartbreaking when you see the stories. So there's no question that social housing brings lower rents and greater stability. It has huge added benefits to the quality of people's lives and their sense of security in the way that Ken described. And so I think we have to keep making that argument. I was particularly impressed, I have to say, when Theresa May came out and said we need to end the stigma of social housing. It was a bold move, actually, that hadn't been heard for quite a while from a prime minister. And maybe we need to return to some of that clear political leadership on ending the stigma of social housing, because it's a very powerful force for good social housing in so many ways, really. And the sooner we can get that across, the better. I just make one last point on this, which is that, of course, because we nominate on need, we are bound to have, as Ken said, a group particularly challenged, if you like, in employment and other terms. But it makes a huge difference if you create social housing as part of mixed tenure communities. I think that's so important. I am seriously worried that we might risk going back to mono-tenure estates, actually, with some of the changes around planning that we have. We must not do that. We must celebrate the move towards mixed tenure developments and communities that we have advanced in recent years.
Thank you very much. Peter, did you want to come in there, or?
I think the only thing I think the report has acted as a myth buster on this particular issue, and it's a stigma that may have arisen, which really there isn't any foundation for. And actually, being in social housing, it provides you with that stability to be able to to go out into the jobs market, and the comfort and knowledge that at home there is nothing untoward going on. Now, I don't want to stigmatize the private rented sector, and probably the way we've allowed the private rented sector to evolve in the UK has meant that a lot of people who are in it, it's a very important part of their income. They may only be in it. A lot of private landlords may only be in it for the short term, and you can understand that. But what that does, it creates uncertainty and worry for the tenants. And I think the private renter, this is an issue for another day. The private renter sector does have a very important role to play in the future, but it probably does need to be reformed. And one of the reforms that needs to be done is in the institutions. The pension funds need to be brought into it. And I think that way you will get a larger and probably more socially responsible private rented sector.
Well, I think that's something that we could all sign up to, being incredibly important. We've got a number of other questions coming in, which is great. Do please keep adding yours. I'm going to put a couple of questions to the panel. So the first is just when we're talking about the employment support programmes that associations delivered, are these delivered directly by housing associations or in partnership? So Jonathan and then Kate, I'll come to you on that in just one moment. But then the second question is, what changes would you like to see in the way that DWP works with housing associations? So we'll come to Peter and then Lindsay on that one. But yeah, on the employment support projects by housing associations, Jonathan and then Kate, if I could put that to you.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. It's a mix. So quite a lot of our work we will deliver direct through our own team, and we have a number of different parts of the team, including a kind of digital service that will help people get online and give them the skills that they need. But invariably, we're working in partnership. So both in terms of putting schemes together and bidding, we're working in partnership as well as in delivery. So if you take our Working Homes project, which we're just about to start, that's £1.2 million worth of programme over 3 years, and we're working with Groundworks and with Croydon Council. So it's a three-way partnership, each of us delivering an equal part of that programme. If you take the Pathways to Employment project that we have, we're working with local delivery agents, the YMCA, a charitable organisation working with mental health, and that helps us get a range of skills, but also supports those charitable organisations that are in our part of the world that are integral to the community as well. So working in partnership is always important. Looking forward and talking about contracts and linking it to the local employments market, we are looking at our net zero carbon agenda and how we improve the carbon performance of all of our stock. So we're talking to the local college and also a green technology supplier about how we can help the college develop their existing construction skills courses and project management courses to give us the skills that we think we and others who are responding to this challenge are going to need. And we're pulling in the private sector suppliers as well to join in that conversation. So as ever, local organisations with local connections are able to put these partnerships together quite effectively, and that helps access funding, but most importantly, it helps then with the subsequent delivery.
Thank you, Jonathan. Kate, do you have anything to add and any perspective from Taurus?
Thanks, Rachel. So yes, I agree with Jonathan absolutely on the mixed approach. You know, recognising the uniqueness of the people that we work with a broad range of partners, whether it be with organisations working with veterans, drug and alcohol addictions, disabilities, a whole raft of different organisations. And I think that's one of the things as a sector that we are particularly good at bringing together. So historically, when we look back at some of the former work programmes that have been available, I think that's where really sort of where we've lost out in actually having that really tailored support that people are absolutely you know, people need that, and our polls today have shown the support for that model of delivery as well, as has the inquiry. So I think the other thing to note is that we often act as an anchor organisation in the areas that we work, and we need to continue to do that using our financial strength. But working with those trusted organisations at a local level, that's one of the things I think that is, you know, an exemplar from the sector in how we work. And just to echo really, I suppose, Jonathan's points as well, those modern methods of construction, looking at green technologies, we're not just thinking about jobs that are here for now, we're thinking about the jobs for the future agenda as well. And again, from a sector, we're really well positioned nationally and to be able to respond to that. So again, working with you know, local colleges, new providers, you know, we're really sort of at the cutting edge of innovation on that front.
Thank you, Kate. And certainly the kind of really high quality employment support programmes that I've seen from PlayShaper members across the country, they are really built on that foundation of partnership and knowing as a housing provider where you can best add to that partnership, but also where other local organisations from the voluntary sector or the private sector are best placed to help you support and deliver that. So then to the question about changes in the way the DWP works, Peter and then Lindsay.
Well, thanks, Rachel. I wasn't really sure how much work the DW, with due respect to my friend and neighbour, the Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, I'm not quite sure how closely housing providers do work with the DWP at the moment. And that may be that you may have hit a very relevant point. Just tracking back on what's just been said, I would agree entirely. It is a partnership approach. There'll be very few housing providers who have the capacity to provide all the necessary skills in-house. It's important. What might work in one area in terms of local authorities, third sector, colleges who you may work with, might not work in another area. So you do need to assess your own local landscape very closely before deciding which is the best way to do, and also guard against, you can have a situation whereby relationships break down, and when that happens, you need to move very quickly to put them right.
Lindsay.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks, Peter. I concur with your concern that there isn't a hugely well-established working partnership nationally between DWP and the housing sector. But we at Communities at Work have been working on and with the DWP for a number of years now. And thinking about this question makes me reflect on the change in that relationship. And I think what we need the DWP continually to do is to understand what we are as a sector, where we are, and how we can operate. And without going into too much history, I think that's really evolved and changed. When Work Programme number 1 came out about 10 years ago, the sector essentially said to the DWP that we would try and meet them on their terms and deliver work programme. And we began that bidding process that Peter talked about, you know, that energy and time into relatively short-term bidding contracts. The reality 10 years on, and as this report attests, is that we are not work programme contractors, and we don't want to be. We are other, we are local, we can operate in devolved institutions, funding and power bases, and we are much more effective at reaching harder to reach communities, individuals and households because we're local and because we operate in that way. So we have moved the conversation on with the DWP, and what we now want them to do is meet us in the middle. And interestingly, and perhaps unexpectedly, the DWP devolves quite a lot of its power already to individual JCP districts. You will often hear lots of partnership discussions going on at DWP nationally, which refer to the power and importance of individual relationships district by district. So in some senses, the DWP has moved ahead on the devolution agenda, and it's there for the partnership and the taking. But it's more complicated and it requires more individual, good, strong relationships at local levels than a single national one-size-fits-all programme can do. So there's some complexity there for the sector to operate in, and for the DWP to understand about us. But I think we are making ground, and we are understood better by the DWP now than ever before. So I look today to all the headlines on devolution, and am heartened that our report so clearly talks about the power of devolved authorities and employment support within that. And I think that now is our time to work with devolved powers, mayoral and local authorities and JCP districts to make that work. My one plea to the DWP and the sector, which is such an easy win, is to back a programme called Jobs Plus, which puts housing, Job Centre Plus and local services together in communities, and it's a service which is local and is open to everyone, irrespective of whether they are signed on to benefits or a JCP customer or not. It's such a simple local weaving of services, and we'd love to see them back that. Thanks, Rachel. Back to you.
Fantastic. I always like a clear ask of people in a response from a panelist. That's great. So building on that point about, I suppose, kind of developing, improving our relationship with the DWP, one of the things that the report touched on was that we don't currently have a kind of clear or consistent qualitative measurement to track the success of our sector programmes. So I think lots of people evaluate their programmes, but that isn't always done consistently. So what do we need to change about that in terms of getting a kind of robust and consistent measurement? So maybe if I'll come to Ken and then Kate on that. And then the second question is, what is the panel's view regarding social impact investment as a means to address the funding continuity? So maybe I'll come to Jonathan and Lindsay on that one. So on the measurement point, Ken, if I can come to you first.
Thanks. You're absolutely right. The measurement issue is really important, and I think it's important for all of the constituencies. It's important for government to see that they're getting good public value for money, for investment in taxpayers' programs. It's important for residents and communities themselves that you know that there's, in a sense, there's a link, a strategy which tries to say this is what our objectives are, and these are the things we're going to do, and this is the impact we expect to see, and this is the value of it, if that's in outcomes or if it's in a monetized well-being measure or whatever it is. That's really important, and it's really important for the provider as well. Instrumentally, it's important because it will probably lead to better bids, but actually on the ground, hopefully, it's actually going to lead to a better set of outcomes for communities and providers. They're doing the things that add value to people's lives. So as we move forward, one of the things that was really striking in both the written evidence and the panel session evidence is the clear knowledge that many of the people we spoke to and many of the people who wrote to us had, that this is important, and the better the impacts are, but understood and measured and credible and robust, the better. And that goes from random control trials in 1 or 2 cases through using things like HACT, Social Value Bank, through a whole set of other approaches to these things, and an awareness of things like the environmental, social and governance measures that the banking sector and the regulator are so interested in. So all those things are really important, but I wouldn't necessarily say that means that there needs to be a consistent single model or suite of models to do these things. It really does depend on the type of activities that are involved. But I just think that the ask in all of that is that there's a much clearer accountability link, I suppose, that bidding for funds should have some kind of impact requirement attached to them, and actually the regulator might also think about impact in terms of the way housing providers think about their strategies for the wider set of activities that they have. I know that's an extra ask on people and all the rest of it, but it's clearly the direction of travel that everyone's moving in, and there are really good reasons for it.
Thank you, Ken. Kate.
Thanks, Rachel. So I echo what Ken says. I think that the challenge with social impact is that we have so many methods that we can use to collect the information. So for me, I think the important thing is that we do have almost some broad headline measurements that we could apply, and as Ken said, whether we do that through the regulator or not, or through some other means, but I think it would be really good to have those. Something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals could actually be a really good headline for us to work towards, and something which we can all contribute to, but also then still measure the impact of the unique programs that we each offer as well in our own unique ways. So I think there's a balance, really. My organisation historically has used the Social Value Bank as one measurement tool, but I think what we also have to reflect is that our programmes have had to shift and change somewhat to adapt to various situations, and you can't always have a one-size-fits-all approach to the measurement. We recognise that we need maybe some alternative methods for that as well. But so, as I say, something like the UN Sustainable Goals might be a really good place for us to collectively start, as I say, with support from the regulator, whether that could be included in a return if providers actually deliver those services. But yeah, I think, as I say, we've got to have that balance of recognising the unique programmes, but also have some headlines.
Completely agree. Thank you. So the social impact investment, Jonathan.
Well, I think my my comment really is much more around that that measuring of the impact, Rachel. We've at PlayShapers we've talked about the the value for money metrics from the regulator, and about how we can consider recommending additions to or supplements to that approach, so that we can get a, if you like, a recognition of the impact that some of our costs are having that otherwise would not get acknowledged. And I think that's important when there is a rounded view of the impact of associations nationally. I really like the idea of the UN Sustainable Goals as well. I think that's an interesting route forward. But I do think that rigor is important, and I was listening to what Kate said about being able to flex and measure as you adapt your services, just making sure that we have that rigor so that it stands up to scrutiny. And we use the HACT methodology as well, which is historically based on the Treasury's Green Book. So I think that comes with a degree of rigor attached to it.
Fantastic, thank you. Did anyone want to come in with a view on social impact investment and whether that might help to address the funding continuity? Lindsay, Peter? Lindsay, Fab.
No, I've got nothing else to add, Rachel. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, just some thoughts rather than determined ways forward on this. Ken rightly mentioned the ESG agenda, the environmental social governance agenda, which is emerging and gaining considerable traction in investment banking and amongst regulators, and increasingly in the social housing sector. So in there is social, but it's part of a wider picture. So I think that social impact measurement should form part of the ESG investment agenda. And I think that the sector could go to the regulator and describe ways in which it's going to understand and work within the ESG framework in its own business activities, in the very heart of its existence. I really like the idea of something as general but relatable as UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are vast and they can feel major in their reach, but actually they also relate right down to individuals, households and organisations to make a difference. So I really like the idea of us doing that. Dare I say, we don't have an Ofsted for housing, and a way in which we can regularise the counting and the impact of social housing and its wider investment in communities. But I, for one, probably in a house party of one sitting by myself, would quite like an Ofsted in housing without creating layer upon layer of more bureaucracy. I think that would be a way of showing, comparing and levelling statistics and the way in which we describe ourselves. Conversely, and slightly at a tangent, so forgive me, Chair, I am minded of Deng Xiaoping, former leader of China, when asked about the difference between communism and capitalism and why they mattered. And he said, a bit enigmatically, I don't care what type of cat we've got, as long as it catches mice. And on that, I see a relation to how we count and measure social value. There are many ways in which we do it, and I feel very relaxed about that, as long as they all, relatively speaking, can recognisably do a similar or the same thing. And on that bombshell, back to you, Rachel.
Not entirely sure how to follow that, so I will do so with our final couple of questions. So thank you to everyone who's posted a question. If we haven't answered yours, then we will, after the event, we'll get back in touch with you and provide you with an answer. I'm sorry we haven't managed to get to all of them. There's been a whole heap of really interesting questions coming in. So I'm going to ask the final two questions, and I'm going to ask if each panelist in turn can say a word or two, and then just anything else that they want to. We've got about 5 minutes left of the discussion, so I'm very interested to hear, but if you could keep your final points succinct, that would be fantastic. So just the final two questions are about digital. one question we've had is that the report highlights a lack of digital access and the barriers that this creates. But obviously at the moment, lots of housing associations are delivering their services through virtual platforms. So we have a question asking about if there are any kind of hands-on practical anecdotes about how that is going, what's been some of the good things and maybe some of the challenges. And then there's the other question about digital is about, should funding be directed to new business ideas that reflect changing current environment, like online services? So are we missing an opportunity for a new jobs market by not focusing more on these services? So for me, there's kind of really two sides of the digital, which is both the huge opportunity, but also the huge kind of challenge and the kind of digital divide that we know exists. So if I can just ask our panelists in turn to say something briefly about that, and any concluding comments, that'd be fantastic. Jonathan, I'll come to you first.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like to say that during COVID, what we've seen is an exponential increase of residents interacting with us online. But actually, we haven't seen that. It's been pretty steady or moved up slightly, but it's not been what you might have expected. What we have seen is a big increase in asks for support. And so in particular, we have a hardship fund, and quite a lot of applications to our hardship fund have been for IT equipment for parents trying to educate their children at home without access to the internet, simply because they haven't got the kit that enables them to do that. So I think for us that the barrier is much more around the kit and about the skills than it is about the appetite. I think the appetite is there amongst our residents. So our focus is on trying to provide both of those things, and we have a couple of people within the organisation that are out and about supporting, or out and about as much as they can do at the moment, supporting residents to get access. So that's the first thing. I think you're absolutely right that housing associations are making their plans based on putting 80% of their work online and allowing residents to self-serve. I think that the appetite is there. The question is about the access to resources for residents to be able to participate. So we're always making sure that we can deliver our services and whatever support that they need without having to access online, but we're trying to move our residents to that place.
Bro, thank you. Ken, any brief comments from you on these points?
Yeah, I would just stress, I suppose, that we found in the evidence that there were two digital issues. Essentially, there's the digital divide kind of question, the lack of skills that some people have, but also an infrastructure and connectivity issue that's been heightened in the last few months, of course. I'd just like to go back to the previous discussion about sustainable development goals for a second. We've just finished a project with HACT for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, which was about the impact of social housing. And in Scotland, we have a public policy framework called the National Performance Framework, which the government refreshes every couple of years, and is basically the ambitions of government in all its formats. And it is now completely connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we did with HACT was we developed a programme of examining the impacts of housing associations and connecting them to housing regeneration goals the government has, and connecting them in turn to these Sustainable Development Goals and National Performance Framework. So there's a nice kind of circular relationship in that. And we were really struck by what an important opportunity that is for housing associations to say, we are speaking directly to the goals of government, these high level ambitions. And sustainable development is a really good way directly into that.
Thank you, Lindsay. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over you at this point, and because we're coming to you for the closing remarks, if that's all right. So Kate and then Peter.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, just to echo really what Jonathan and Ken have touched on. So we've had some really good examples where we've been able to secure funding to be able to distribute IT kit to people in need. But I do think that, you know, that the digital divide is something that we can't ignore. We've got communities across the Liverpool City region that don't have the digital infrastructure that they need to engage fully. And I think the other element that we have to consider, particularly in our circumstances, Taurus, is that over half of our population who live in our properties are over the age of 50. So we do have an ageing population, and whilst we have many people who are digitally connected, we also have a lot of people who don't want to be digitally connected, anecdotally speaking, because that again for us is another challenge, is we don't know how many people are actually fully digitally connected, and I suppose that's a challenge we probably all have there. So in terms of the new business ideas that reflect the job market, absolutely, we've got to look at investing in all opportunities that do create jobs, because whilst we can help people move into employment, if we don't have the opportunities there for people to enter into, what we're actually doing isn't actually going to be very effective at all. So for me, yes, we must invest in those jobs too.
Fantastic, thank you, Kate. Peter, just any very brief final?
Very quickly, the digital access problem, for as has been highlighted, there are two aspects of it. There is the poor infrastructure, which I think we have put money at in this country, but we've done it in a rather haphazard way. If you look at certain Scandinavian and Baltic countries, it is their #1 priority. And I think we have something to learn with them. Secondly, with regard to skills, that is something that does urgently need to address. I was talking to the hospitality and the tourism sector yesterday. At the moment, that is a sector that faces serious challenges over the next 6 months. But I sense after that, there will be a move towards staycations, and this is a sector, a lot of SMEs, which employs an awful lot of people. And the person I was speaking to yesterday was expressing alarm how in some of our coastal communities, where this industry can play an important role, there is a lack of skills. That is something that urgently needs to be addressed. My concluding remark is, I'm very grateful to everyone for producing this report and hosting this very, very worthwhile discussion this morning. And when we look at the recommendations, I'll go slightly against the poll. To my mind, the important issue is continuity of funding. If you provide that, then you provide those local providers, those local groups working together with the means of actually coming up with these local solutions.
Fantastic, thank you, Peter, and thank you very much to our whole panel. Your insights and reflections have been hugely valuable. I'm going to hand over now to Lindsay for her closing remarks, but just before I do, I just wanted to say I think that the final report of this APPG has been a huge team effort. There's been a number of people who've contributed a huge amount, but Lindsay, I genuinely don't think we would be sitting here if it wasn't for your leadership of this project. You've been hugely diligent, you've been so knowledgeable, you're fantastic to work with, and I'm not sure that without you we would have continued to push the APPG forward. So it's been a real pleasure to work with you, and thank you for all of your fantastic leadership of this work. And I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thank you. That was an unexpected and very lovely introduction. Thank you, Rachel. Great sharing, hugely appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed the discussion and hearing the perspectives from people today. So I do have just final closing thanks and a word on what we do next. So I'll keep this brief, but thank you for staying on for it. Thanks to everyone who signed up today and registered. We had over 250 registered attendees today, which is a fantastic number. We're delighted to have you. On behalf of Place Shapers and Communities that Work, we thank our members for their support in coming today and for the APPG support. And as a tiny reminder to any organisation who may be watching this, who may not be a Place Shapers member or a Communities that Work member, please bear us in mind on your Christmas list. We can't exist without you members, so thank you very much. And look us up if you've never heard of us before. I'd like to say thank you sincerely to Peter Aldous MP as co-chair of this APPG for supporting today and for supporting the APPG right the way through from the very foundation when we had a first cup of tea in Portcullis House with Peter Aldous about 3 years ago to discuss this APPG. So sincere thanks to you, Peter, Normally we'd be raising a glass to you on the terrace pavilion this evening, but instead I'll raise my virtual coffee cup to you and say thank you very much. We also thank Liz Twist MP, who supported our preview event last week and is the other co-chair for the APPG. So between Peter and Liz, they work beyond party political lines very effectively and openly to advance the interests of the APPG and of our members and the housing sector. Sincere thanks there, and indeed to all the other officials from the APPG who've supported it and played a role. Special thanks there to Sally Ann Hart MP, who joined some of our evidence sessions through the APPG inquiry over summer and autumn. Thank you to the funders, who you can see on our slide here, who each enabled this inquiry to be commissioned and for this report to be launched today. We seriously couldn't have done it without you, and we are very grateful for your support. So thank you to all 5 of the organisations that you can see on your screen there. Thanks to the evidence submitters, all 61 of you, and the panel session joiners. We ran 11 sessions, including a tenant panel inquiry session over summer and into early autumn, and got hugely rich information building on the written evidence. Again, there'd be no report without you, so thank you. And my last thanks go to Ken and to Cash for providing us with an excellent report and an evidence base that we need to move forward and turn this report and its recommendations into some action. So on those last thanks, I'll simply talk about what we do from today. This is the start point of the life of this report. So it outlines a number of recommendations, and we will seek from now on, with our parliamentary colleagues in the APPG and other support bases of MPs, to advance those recommendations in Parliament and through devolved authorities. There are 5 key recommendations, but the 3 I think I'd like to focus on right now, as Peter said, is securing that certainty in funding, looking at the devolution of funding, so national programmes that can be delivered locally, and linking social housing investment to local employment support. All of those are doable, as Lord Kerslake said. We already deliver tailored support to our tenants and residents, so that's a given. So the work really is in reaching all of those government departments, in using the task force which we've established on housing and employment, but very much using our MP and devolved power connections to make the circumstances support those recommendations. And they are realistic and they are doable. So through the APPG and through our partnership with Playshapers, we will continue to involve you as members, as constituency bases and as housing providers in that work. So please stay with us as we try to land the policy recommendations which are found in the Improving Opportunities report and launched today. So that really is it. In the second or so, I'll hand to BECG, who have technically supported the event today. So it really is a final thank you to everyone you can see on your screen, to our very able chair who's taken us through this event so seamlessly, and to everyone who supported the event. Stay with us as we work on landing the findings, support us, and with Bob Kerslake we go forward in hope, and this report has plenty of hope within it. So thank you very much, and we'll close the webinar at this stage. Have a lovely morning everyone, and stay dry. Take care. Thank you.